Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Before we start, I want to draw your attention to the two ways you can support the podcast financially and, by doing so, help this podcast continue on into the future. If you'd like to make a one-off donation, I've set up a Just Giving page where you can donate as much or as little as you like. Alternatively, there are 6 different levels of subscription, starting from just £5 a month over at patreon.com/A Mic on the Podium. There you'll find 2 new podcast series, a monthly bulletin, group and personal Zoom meetings, articles, mini episodes attached to this series, and the chance to have some conducting lessons from myself. The details are in the show notes below, and I'd greatly appreciate any help you can manage. Today, I conduct a conversation with a young British conductor who won the 2017 Nestlé and Salzburg Festival Young Conductors Award. He regularly guest conducts with orchestras all across the globe, as well as being a chief conductor with his orchestra in Austria. It's a great pleasure to welcome Kerem Hasan. Kerem, wonderful to speak to you today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Real pleasure. What's lockdown been like for you? Have you been working at all? Have you, like me, just suddenly stopped looking at scores because there's no deadline? What have you been up to?
Well, I mean, I think it changed over a couple of months, actually. To begin with, I did absolutely nothing. I just thought I wanted a break anyway from scores, from music. So I didn't really listen to that much music. I certainly didn't open my scores for a while. And I pursued other endeavors, whether that was, reading or going for walks or, what have you. But then after a while, I kind of got a little bit of an itch. So then started to pick up scores here and there and everything like that. But it's strange because obviously we prepare for things which may or may not happen given the fluidity of the situation. So yes, studying somewhat, but not consistently, I'd say.
Much the same here. I've realised I'm a deadline-driven sort of person, and now there are some deadlines looming. I'm happily back to pencils and scores and learning again and listening. Like you, I didn't listen to any music at all, really, for the first 2 or 3 months. Whilst we're talking about music, do you come from a musical family? What's music like when you grew up? How did it start? What got you into it?
Absolutely no musicians in my family. My father is a barber, and my mum, she's trained to be a lawyer, when I was about 15, 16. Otherwise she kind of stayed at home and kind of brought me up. Music at home was funny because I started on the piano and was I think I took to it quite well and had a very, very supportive piano teacher. I mean, with parents that were not involved in music at all, they just pretty much went along with what my wonderful teacher said, which was, make sure he does some practice because there's potential for this one. And my father has, I have to be honest, absolutely no interest in classical music. He loves Iron Maiden, Dream Theater, and so I would kind of come in Friday, Saturday evenings into the living room, and on the hi-fi system there was all of this Iron Maiden blaring out. So it's a little bit eclectic in that way. I mean, there was no real classical music being performed other than by me kind of tinkling the ivories, really. Yeah.
Well, I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, obviously, I've spoken to previous conductors who've come from a very classically based background. In my house, it was Cliff Richard, Johnny Mathis, Barry Manilow, that sort of stuff was happening. And the more I started playing my sort of music, learning the violin, classical music started to appear because there was an interest in it. But I don't think it's a bad thing at all.
Yeah. I think it was definitely quite organic in that way. I mean, I think my love of classical music grew from simply my love of classical music, and not because there was anyone else who was doing it, and I felt obliged or interested in doing it that way. So it was an interesting way to get into it. Yeah.
And the piano was your instrument throughout. Did you dabble in any?
It was. Yeah. I didn't. I mean, I in some ways I wish I had. And obviously being a pianist has its advantages and disadvantages, especially obviously when it comes to working with orchestras. But I went more into working with singers, actually, at a kind of youngish age. And I think combining that love of working with singers, well, on the piano and coaching them, and then kind of going into conducting felt more natural for me anyway. So it was kind of approaching the orchestra, but maybe from the opposite direction, you could say.
Well, that's fair enough. And so through school and then on to further studies, I read at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in Glasgow, and in piano and conducting, or did the conducting come later?
No, it was. I was so glad I went up to the RCS in Glasgow. They're such a magnificent institution because I did the rounds, for many places in the UK in terms of auditions, and I obviously auditioned mainly as a pianist. And so many of these music colleges turned around to me, and after I expressed an interest in conducting at the age of about 17. They all said, we prefer our conductors to make their own opportunities. And really, Glasgow was the only place I went to. And they turned around and said, if you're that interested in it, then we'll help you out and see what we can do for you. And me and there was another young student with the first cohort of these kind of joint study instrument and conducting undergraduates. And so, at the age of 18, rocking up to the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland and, being thrown into preparation rehearsals for Mahler. I think it was Mahler 6. I mean, things that I probably wouldn't even do now, to be honest. And just going, being thrown straight into those, but, all fantastic experience. Yeah.
And had you done any conducting at all before then?
Well, I'd done bits and pieces. I was a Saturday student at the Junior Royal Academy in London, and it was there that I met and got to work a lot with the wonderful teacher, Peter Stark, who is the professor of conducting at the Royal College of Music, but he kind of taught at the weekends at the RAM. And it was there that I really developed an interest in conducting. But I think my real interest in conducting began just a little bit earlier after I did my work experience for 2 weeks at the English National Opera and the Royal Opera House. And that came about totally by chance because, I don't know, for the listeners who aren't completely aware of work experience, just to spend a couple of weeks shadowing people in a profession that you think you might be interested in is pretty normal at the age of 16.
Yes.
And there was nothing for me to do. I mean, I was playing the piano. Friends of mine were going off to, I don't know, banks and dentists and doctors and things like that. And I thought, what does a pianist do? But as it happened, the then head of casting, her daughter attended the same high school as me. And so she quite kindly said, well, if you want to come and shadow, please, by all means. So I spent a wonderful 2 weeks shadowing Ed Gardner and Tony Pappano at
wow.
ENO and the Royal Opera, which was wonderful and really just kind of lit the fire of conducting for me.
That's a wonderful work experience week. One wonders sometimes when these people go into an orchestra on work experience, whether they're just stood in the corner, licking envelopes to send out to patrons or to subscribers or whatever. But that sounds like a wonderful way of experiencing an opera house, and to follow those two, that's a great thing. Back to Glasgow. I'm assuming at this point the head of the course was Gary Walker, and no, not Gary Walker.
No, it wasn't Gary Walker.
Well.
I did work closely with Gary for a few years, actually. But when I first joined, he was a regular guest,
right.
As it were. I studied with a wonderful Scottish conductor called Alistair Mitchell,
right.
Who has worked for a very long time up at the Royal Conservatoire and was kind of gave me the grounding that I needed.
And what was his? Because I don't think it's a name that's cropped up before. What was his style? If you think that a Musin student, a lot of it was on stick technique, whereas a Hans Swarovski student, as we're told, Abardo and Mater had about 10 minutes of stick technique and the rest of it was about score study. What was the balance, do you think, with Alistair Mitchell?
Well, I would say there was a lot of talking involved in the good sense.
Yes.
And it was really talking and trying to understand, what it actually means to be a conductor. Of course, there was stick technique and, just in terms of how to give a cue to a particular section, or, various habits that we might develop when we're younger, well, even now, to be honest. But there was definitely a lot of talking about the kind of psychology of working with a big group of people, what they need from you, not just in terms of how you move, but in terms of how you talk, how you present yourself. And obviously that leads into discussions about scores and all the various subjects that are attached to that. So very broad-minded, I would say.
At the end of your time in Glasgow, or was it one of these Erasmus years, you ended up going to the University of Music Franz Liszt in Weimar. Again, were you piano and conducting, or by now had the piano taken a backward step?
Well, by that time, I was still playing piano to a very, very high level, but I knew that I wanted to do conducting. And so my time in Germany for those 6 months, and it was that wonderful, wonderful scheme, Erasmus, which was to study for a semester in a university of your choice, was fantastic. And I'd never worked in Germany. I'd never worked with German-speaking teachers, or in that culture that is very much based around the opera house and the Kapellmeister system, and that was totally new to me. And so, aside from doing an A-level in German, which I'd promptly forgotten 2 years later, I had to try and pick up German as quickly as possible. And going to somewhere like Weimar, which is it was drenched in German culture, but nobody really spoke English in that part of Germany, which is very far to the east. It was a fascinating but a slightly scary experience, if I'm honest, because I just felt completely out of my depth. There were these other conductors there who were way more advanced than me. There were conductors whose careers were just kicking off as I was arriving, and I would, read about them conducting, the XYZ orchestra and thinking, my God, that's fantastic. I want to do that. But realizing that I had such a long way to go. And I think in some ways that's really useful, because being a small fish in a big pond makes you work. And I worked so hard for those 6 months. Also because I did my Erasmus in the winter semester. So it was freezing when I was there. It dropped down to -15 or something like that, and you simply couldn't go out anywhere, so you just had to study your scores.
And were you conducting piano classes? Was that individual one-to-one lessons? Did you have an ensemble you could conduct whilst you were there?
It was, as far as I remember, it was a really broad mixture. The opportunity to work with very big ensembles came once or twice a semester, but there was a regular option of conducting a smaller ensemble, I think it was a string quartet or something like that, every now and again. But otherwise, the work that Nicolas Pasquet, who is the professor there, does is quite unique in terms of conducting classes, and they conduct in silence. They don't use any pianists. They don't use, for the most part, any ensembles. Everything is done in silence. So you'll stand up on the podium, the teacher will be opposite, along with 5, 6, 7 of your colleagues, and you'll go from the beginning of the movement and just conduct as if the orchestra's there. You'll hear it in your head, they might hear it in there, and they'll hopefully hear it in their heads.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very interesting way, certainly one that I've never done since, in terms of studying.
Yeah.
Really fascinating way of working, because it really forces you to hear the music in your head.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of work that you can play a recording and go along to that, or rely on the orchestra to just play the right notes. You really have to know everything.
Yeah.
And so for that was really fascinating, I have to say.
I find that fascinating. It's not a process or a way of teaching I've ever heard of before. It's something we can all do in the privacy of our own studies with the score open. Whether you're actually waving your arms around or not is forming this soundtrack of the piece in your own brain. But to actually do it in front of other people, that's where for me the weirdness comes in. But then if you're sitting there observing, I suppose what you're doing is you are seeing what the conductor wants. You're seeing their interpretation. You're seeing the tempo that they want. It's not driven by two pianists who are or aren't watching you, and it's not driven by the ability of the orchestra that you might be conducting at that student level. It's purely about the fantasy of what's in your own head.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's
And
fascinating.
it might sound quite strange to say actually, but the number of times I remember sitting in the room and again, it might sound a little strange, and thinking that it's getting loud in here in some ways, but loud in your head because,
Yeah.
we would, kind of mute conduct, Brahms symphonies, big Beethoven symphonies. And so, as you said quite rightly, the ability to hear yourself as clearly as possible, everything that you've studied, I think is a real advantage.
That's brilliant. I may well be stealing some of that. Whether I'll steal all of it for my students, I don't know, but I may steal some of it. And then on Zurich University of the Arts, and to a name that I have heard of, but I don't think he's appeared on this podcast. The reason why I've heard of Johannes Schleffli,
Absolutely.
Johannes Schleffli, is because he taught Mirga Gražinytė Tyla, who is the music director of CBSO. And what was Johannes like? I don't know much about his teaching style. I just know of his name because of the connection with Mirga. What does his teaching style involve?
He is by far one of the most wonderful people that I've met. And I would say probably the biggest influence on me, because I did spend a good 3.5 years working with him.
Yeah.
In order to tell you what he's like as a teacher, I just need to tell you what it's like studying in Zurich, because that was a brilliant experience in of itself. So when I started back in 2014, 15, I think this was, yes, 14, 15, they had just built a brand new building for the students. And because it's the Zurich University of the Arts, they brought together all these different kind of areas of art. So whether that's photography students, or whether those are the dancers and all, of course, the musicians, absolutely phenomenal facilities. Dozens and dozens of practice rooms, a whole basement floor with thousands of square feet dedicated just to practice rooms. Really fantastic. On top of that, we had the ability to work every single week for 3 hours with a string quintet and a wind quartet and 2 pianos. With that, you can do pretty much any repertoire within reason. And that was our laboratory. We would work there, and we would work towards regular appearances or masterclasses, I should say, with orchestras in Central and Eastern Europe, for the most part, sometimes Southern Germany as well. Where we would go for a week at a time. We would have 3 days of rehearsing the orchestra and a concert at the end. And it was working like that for 3 years, 4 years. I mean, it was extremely intensive and extremely time consuming. There is no time to do anything else because there's always the next project coming up. To get to Johannes' style of teaching, I should probably say that none of his students, or ex-students for that matter, look the same in terms of their conducting. As the technique that he has, because for the most part, he never really conducted anything for us. And so everything was about getting into the psychology of conducting and about talking and watching yourself back and trying to, in a way, it's a bit like therapy. You talk yourself into your solutions a lot of the time. And he would just very gently nudge you in the right direction. So everything was recorded, including these 3-hour ensembles that we would have every week. And every 2 weeks, I think it was, there would also be one-to-one sessions where we would spend an hour watching our videos back in a one-to-one format and commenting. Also in groups, we'd often do this on what we could do better and what didn't go so well and what we thought was very good. And if there was one thing that Johannes promoted, and he still promotes to this day, I have to say, it is a really amicable atmosphere in the class. We work together. No one is competing. And I have to say, in comparison to other studios that I've seen, it's not always the way. So the one thing that that was always drilled into us, kind of subconsciously in a way, was you are always free to comment on each other's conducting and provide constructive criticism. And that not only paves the way, to getting better as a musician and as a conductor, but also allows you to stand up in front of an orchestra and be prepared for feedback from an orchestra.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
sometimes it doesn't always go to plan, and people might say that we could do things better. And so it allows us to move our egos to one side and just work on what it is we need to do, which is getting the music to a standard that is going to be what the composer wanted eventually.
Yeah. Well, it also gives you the chance to musically listen to what's coming back at you from the orchestra and think, hey, actually that's a better idea than what I thought. And as you say, if you leave your ego to one side and accept what comes at you, that's a wonderful thing. That sounds like a really intensive yet enjoyable 3 or 4 years of study.
It was absolutely fantastic, I have to say. And just to finish off with that, the work ethic of everyone in that class, and it still continues in this way, is so focused and dedicated, because I think everyone who studies there also realizes how lucky they are to have those kind of opportunities as well, because it's not cheap to hire orchestras, and certainly not cheap to hire orchestras 3 or 4 times a semester as well.
Well, the other thing I was going to focus in on is the use of video. I use video where possible when I teach, mainly down to my experiences with Jorma Panela, and he's another one who uses video almost exclusively in a group scenario where you all sit and watch the video back. And he never used to comment often, but when he commented on anybody's video, you're all sitting and watching and thinking, right, what's he going to say next? I do remember the last 2 words he said to me in my last video session with him, which was of the concert where I'd conducted the last 2 movements of Shostakovich's First Symphony, and stopped, and he just turned around and said, "Yes, almost professional," and which I took as a compliment. But by then, I was already getting professional work, but I took that as a compliment. But yeah, I mean, those video sessions are illuminating, and I think what it does, hopefully you'll agree with me, is it frees up when you're actually conducting, whether it's the quintet and the quartet or a bigger ensemble. It frees you up to concentrate on the job in hand, and you're not thinking about technical things. It's the same as a golfer shouldn't be thinking about what he's doing with his left wrist when he's about to drive down the first fairway of the US Open. He should just be thinking hit the ball, and think about the course. And it's the same when you're conducting. You shouldn't be worried about what your second beat in 3 looks like,
Absolutely.
or your posture or what you're doing with your legs. You deal with that afterwards with the video.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I've definitely kept in touch a lot with Johannes since I finished studying there. And, sometimes I might call him up and I'll say, I've got this project coming up. Or I might actually call him up in the middle of a week and say, this has happened so far. And what shall I do? Or I don't know what to do next. Or can I have some advice about what you might think on this? And a lot of the time he says, just trust your instincts, forget everything. You've studied all of this, and you're absolutely right. That is why those video sessions take place. We do them in order to forget them, to put them to a part of our mind where we don't need to focus on that at the time. And the overarching theme that conductors, I think, should be having in a week of orchestral concerts is, how are we rehearsing? And how is that trajectory from the first rehearsal to the concert improving, or
Yes.
we hope to be improving?
Yeah.
And that was actually a huge focus in our conversations as well, is how do you rehearse an orchestra? And what is a good rehearsal? What defines a good rehearsal? And that is a really, really hard question to answer, because so many orchestras work differently or expect different things from their conductors or their guest conductors or their chief conductors even. But I think the one overarching idea is ultimately that the conductor is serving the music. And, it's certainly something that we hear time and time again, but it is so true. And that is, orchestras can sniff out egos very, very quickly. And they can also smell somebody who's not being genuine.
Yeah.
And so I think if you come from a place which is sincere, humble, honest, and very, very true to the score, then it stands you in good stead. Of course, there's, a fair bit more to that, but I think that's a really, really important thing to discuss when studying conducting.
Looking ahead, I mean, obviously having spent 3 years with Johannes, if I just pick out some names, you worked with Robert Spano in Aspen for a couple of years, I think, but also masterclasses with David Zinman, Ada de Waart, Jan Andrea Nozeda, Esa-Pekka Salonen. Were those 5 names or so, when you encountered them and they gave you bits of advice in masterclasses and sessions at Aspen, were they just like the icing on top of the cake of what you'd learned from Johannes and back further at the RCS? Or did any of them give you something that suddenly made you change maybe an opinion of a part of conducting or whatever?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because often we get bombarded with advice and it's difficult to know which way to go, especially if it's contradictory advice.
Yeah. Well, I have to say there weren't any huge paradigm shifts in a way.
Yeah.
But I think all of those conductors are incredibly unique. And in some ways, when you spend 3 years studying in one place and you think you develop an idea of what conducting means or what it's like, or what it should be like, I should say, and then you come across somebody who does something completely differently, in a way, and achieves phenomenal results, and you think, well, that doesn't quite compute with exactly what I thought it should be like. What I mean is that obviously everyone has very different personalities, and those personalities shine through in rehearsals, in their technique and things like that. I mean, I can think of some conductors, who talk a lot in their rehearsals, and somehow it works for them. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are some conductors who barely say 2 words, and it works equally well. And so I think having the opportunity to, work with, assist, or take masterclasses from, these names that you mentioned, simply opened my eyes probably to 2 things. That firstly, everyone is different. And secondly, you have to find your own way of doing it.
Yeah.
In some ways, I saw conductors that I absolutely adore and think to myself, well, I would love to be like that. But ultimately, I'm not like that. That's not my personality. And I can't pretend to be like that.
No, it's absolutely right. I think there seems to be a very common thread on most of the conductors who come on here. Doesn't matter what their journey is. And obviously, the journeys have been so vastly different in 50 odd episodes, is that, at the end, virtually all of the conductors have said, you've got to be yourself and you've got to work out what works for you. And I think that, that's what the successful ones have done, is they've worked that out.
The problem with that is that ultimately there is a difficulty in that. I mean, one of the reasons that I started conducting in the first place is because I really wanted to work with other people rather than sit as a pianist by myself in a practice room. I mean, in reality, I didn't realize that I'd be sitting by myself with it in front of a desk instead of a piano. But I mean, ultimately, I think when we try to learn or to get comfortable in front of orchestras, get comfortable in being ourselves in front of groups of people, there is no substitute for being in front of those groups to do that. And so the only way that you can do that is through a sometimes brutal trial and error. And that's why, at the beginning of your career as a younger conductor, I think it's incredibly important to find the right kind of opportunities with orchestras. And in order to feel like you're in a slightly safer space with an orchestra that is understanding that you are younger. And that's not always the case. And so, of course, we want to be ourselves. But on the other hand, how do we get that experience? It's a tricky one.
It is a very tricky one. One way that some conductors sort of burst onto the scene is competitions. I know for a fact that you entered one, at least, because you were a finalist in the Donatello Flick. What are your thoughts on competitions? Was it always a plan to enter them? Did you enjoy them, despite the sort of competitive element, especially having been in Johannes' class where, as you said, he actively encouraged not being competitive? What did you find the whole experience like? And do you think that that it was a help or a hindrance. I'm very happy that by the time I started conducting seriously, I was 35, which meant I was too old to enter any competitions. I'm very glad about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, what was it like? What are they like?
I mean, if I speak completely candidly, I absolutely despise competitions. I think that they are a necessary evil, but they're not the only way in order to develop a career, and that should be said from the outset. They're they can be a faster way, but they are inherently dangerous as well, because I think a lot of the time people don't realize what is involved if you do have any success in a competition. Certainly when I entered my first competition, I've only ever done 2 in my life. I entered the Donatella Flick back in 2016. I had no expectations because I'd never entered a competition. I was extremely nervous, extraordinarily nervous from the first round. And although I might be quite good at seeming calm when I'm on the podium, certainly beforehand, it was, extremely nerve-wracking. I didn't know what to expect, and even from logistical elements of a competition, like having jury members sitting behind the orchestra watching you. I mean, goodness me, you're talking to a first violin section, and suddenly you see Yuri Temirkanov sitting behind them, and you think, oh goodness, what am I saying the right thing? Have I even said what I should be? Should I have even stopped? So in that respect, it was hard work, and I think no one enjoys the competitions. Of course, getting the opportunity to work with the London Symphony, and they were extremely nice, extremely kind, because they recognized that the 3 finalists are younger and have less experience and will make mistakes. But they were so supportive, and I think that made all the difference. And certainly, in a competition like the Donatella Flick, which is so well run and so well prepared, where you do have a final concert in the end. You have a concert with the London Symphony in the Barbican, which is shared between 3 finalists. I think the best way of looking at that is simply for what it is, a concert, and to just do your best as you would. So it was hard work. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And I wish there were other ways to go about developing a conducting career that are quicker, like competitions are. But unfortunately, there are not, because there is another side to conducting, which I'm not sure how much it's spoken of, or you've spoken about with your other guests. But there can be a lot of politics in what we do. And what I mean by that are being able to sell yourself in the right way, and also, being a flavor of the month or something like that. It can be a very, very brutal world, if I'm honest. And unfortunately, I do think that competitions play into that, or can play into that, because what comes afterwards, you have to be ready for, which is a huge amount of publicity and attention. And actually, one of the best pieces of advice that I had after having been a finalist in the Donatella Flick was learn to say no. It was that these opportunities come at you thick and fast, and that you have to be prepared to know what your limit is. At the same time, you don't want to be overcautious with everything, but it's a big world out there, and there are a lot of different orchestras. And so knowing what is best, knowing who you can really trust, who you can confide in, it's rare that you can really find someone that you trust. And I mean, from colleagues or managers or something like that. But that is also a crucial part, which also ties together with the element of competitions.
Well, I think this is some of the advice that have come from competition winners or finalists, or in these podcasts. We're recording this episode in September, just after the Mark Wigglesworth episode came out, and he told everybody that he basically said no to all of the work that was offered him after winning, because he realised that just because he'd won didn't make him a great conductor. He still had things to learn, and he didn't want to be put up on that pedestal too soon. Ryan Bancroft said when he'd won his competition, don't enter these things without being fully aware of what it's going to be like afterwards. And they all talk about needing a shoulder to lean on, cry on, Whether that be a manager or an agent or a confidant within the profession. I think you're absolutely right, because you are going to be the flavour of the month, the next big thing, the whatever cliched phrase you can think of. Well, the minute you win that competition, everybody will be looking at you, and that's the dangerous time, and not to think, well, I'm the next greatest thing. That's the time to get your feet firmly on the ground and go, right, now what do I do with this?
Exactly.
Yeah, sudden publicity.
And suddenly going from weeks with kind of orchestras which were masterclass and concert at the end, to suddenly being a guest conductor by yourself for the week, and which involves, well, unless you know people in the city, but it can involve, 3 meals a day by yourself. Absolutely no one giving you any feedback. No one is telling you whether your rehearsal went well. No one is telling you whether the orchestra are playing at the very best that they can. Being all by yourself and having to rely on your own training and your own instincts, that is hard work. And I think actually, primary to these competitions, that is where the hard work really begins.
Yes. Well, that was going to be my next topic, guesting. And you've sort of already said what it's like, and honestly what it's like as well. And for those who are completely in the dark about how it works, is that having done your first week with the XYZ Symphony Orchestra, wherever that may be, you might not find out from your agent or manager what they thought of you for anywhere between 2 weeks to 6 months. So, that's always playing in the back of your head, even though you might think the concert was a roaring success, but you don't know what the orchestra thinks of you, because of it's the rehearsals that the orchestra are also involved with, and a lion's share of what their opinion will be based on how you rehearsed and how you got them to that concert. And you can be sitting in this limbo land waiting for all of this information for months. And you won't know until the phone rings your agent and says, "We really enjoyed that. Can we book him again for next year?" That you won't know. And you do that week after week after week at the beginning when your career first starts, and that's tough, because you're playing all sorts of mental games inside of your head. I mean, some weeks you can feel, well, when we come on to your job in Innsbruck with the Tiroler Symphony Orchestra, that was obviously a week that went very well, but there's also there are weeks that don't go well. I've had
that's also the case, and I think it's really, really important to focus on those, because we are only ever, I mean, I say publicly, but we are only ever, if things are officially published, only going to hear about the successes.
Yes.
We don't hear about the ones that didn't, the weeks that didn't go well or something like that. And, make no mistake, every single conductor has had bad weeks with an orchestra. There is not one. Of the greatest conductors that you can ever think of, there is not one that hasn't had a bad week with an orchestra. But I think the real kind of aim amongst that is to recognize what was it that didn't go according to plan. And the hardest situation, I think, to realize is where the chemistry between you and the orchestra simply isn't there. Because no matter how, quote unquote, good you are, or how well you rehearse, or even the results that you produce in the end, ultimately you're working with people, and it's a people's relationship in order to produce that music that is very important. And so if there isn't that chemistry between you and the orchestra, it's like being on a date with somebody. If you think, it's just not working out, then it just doesn't work out. Sometimes you can't really explain it. And you just have to accept that. But that's also sometimes difficult to accept, because we obviously want to do as well as we can all the time. We are preparing these wonderful works of music, sometimes with wonderful orchestras, and we want them to be a great success. And when it's not, we have to ask these hard questions as to why it happened.
Yes, and also for the listener, that often these concerts are reviewed afterwards. And let me tell you, dear listener, whatever the reviewer wrote, often it has nothing to do with how your week went with the orchestra. I've had really bad reviews for a wonderful week, and I've had really good reviews for a week where I thought, well, really? Where did you get that from? The other interesting thing is, when I was a player, I was on an artistic committee, and we would review every conductor. And when the chief executive says to you, but it got a wonderful review and the audience seemed to really enjoy it, you have to say, well, yeah, that was despite what was going on in the rehearsals, that happens, but it's such an important subject for anybody who wants to think about being a conductor, is knowing that it's not all wine and roses, and sometimes things just don't work. And as you say, it doesn't. You try as hard as you like. Sometimes you have to walk away and go, fine, okay,
absolutely.
It doesn't work. But, as I said, at some point you went to the Tiroler Symphony Orchestra in Innsbruck, and it must have worked, because from 2019 onwards you've been their chief conductor. What was that like? Was that a love at first sight, speed date thing, or did you gently fall in love with each other over a number of dates?
Well, it was interesting. We had my first experience with them was in the concert hall, not in the opera pit, because they are also an opera orchestra.
Yeah.
And I was actually stepping in for a colleague who was sick, or happened to be sick, I think about a week's notice or something like that. And it was great repertoire. It was the Verdi Force of Destiny Overture, a Mozart piano concerto with Salim Ashkar, fantastic pianist, and Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. And I, as a young conductor, I was fortunate in that I'd done 2 of the 3 works. I'd done the symphony before, and I'd done the overture. And so I thought, this is great. I feel at least confident with the repertoire. I had no idea what I was walking into. Obviously, you don't know what the orchestra are going to be like. But in the end, we had 2 phenomenal concerts. They were a highlight for me of the season, and I hope they were also a highlight for the orchestra. But as part of their hiring process, they also wanted, and this is really interesting, they wanted their potential chief conductors to step into the opera pit and conduct opera. And so, and this is very much a Austro-German Swiss element of working in the opera house. They do these things called Nachdirigats, which are essentially after conducting. So, after the show has started and you're maybe on performance number 6 or 7, another conductor will come in, often the evening before, meet with the singers on the day, and go and conduct the opera cold that evening. And so we were given a list of operas that we can conduct to choose from. I chose Tales of Hoffmann by Offenbach, and I basically got the video of what the production looked like on stage, so I could at least see where the singers were coming from. But I had no warm-up. No one has any warm-up for that. You just go in and conduct this 3.5-hour long opera. And, that must have gone well, because a few months later, we got the phone call to say that, they very much like you to work as the chief conductor. So if I have to say, one of the more nerve-wracking experiences was doing that. Because it's one thing to work with an orchestra, and with all due love and respect, it's also another thing to work with singers, because singers have so many other things to think about on top of just the music. And it's very easy for us listeners or musicians to simply hear what they're doing. But I mean, playing with props, and often directors asking you to hang upside down while singing this, it can be extremely problematic and complicated.
Yes.
And so I think as an opera conductor, you need to have a level of empathy and understanding with the singers in order to kind of bring out the best in them.
Yeah.
And of course, rehearsing singers, that's completely another subject. But essentially, it was this 3.5 hours conducting Offenbach's Tales of Hoffmann, as well as a symphony orchestra concert. And they are very kind enough to offer me the job.
Wonderful. I've always thought that those sort of opera gigs, Andres Nelson's told me about, going in for the first time at the Vienna State Opera and doing a one-off La Bohème. But then he'd been, music director of the Latvian National Opera. So he'd done his own La Bohème. He'd probably done 50 or 60 performances of it. I always thought that was purely the sort of the world of the opera conductor who did that. But that sounds like a frightening experience. but a challenge. And I would never be put off by something like that. Having done a couple of operas, that sounds like fun. In a sort of sadistic way, but
It is,
yeah, you're right about the singers. Yeah, that with the orchestra in particular, that you can deal with orchestras. It's dealing with the singers and the props and what they're supposed to be, what the directors have got them doing. That's the tough thing.
It's absolutely, and in an opera production, it's learning where your place is, because I think at the very beginning of the opera rehearsal process, the role of the conductor is less important to what it is much later on in the process.
Yeah.
So of course, at the beginning, you give the place and the space to the director to lay out their plans. I mean, at least I try and be as open as I can. I want to know what it is they have planned for this opera. And of course, as things go away, I might kind of gently or not so gently have to say, no, we can't do this, or this might not be possible, or that's a great idea. But, to try and work in a very collaborative way and join that together with the music making, that's the fun in opera, I would say. That is a hugely rewarding experience.
It is making me chuckle though, because there's this famous Beecham story, which I'm sure you know, about the soprano trying to deliver her aria whilst lying on a chaise longue, and eventually she said, "Oh, but Sir Thomas, I can't perform in this position." To which his riposte was, "My dear, I've given some of my best performances in that position." Not very PC in this current climate, but that's Thomas Beecham for you. But they're the sort of things that directors ask singers to do, to sing whilst lying prone on a chaise longue, or as you say, hanging upside down, or in a cherry picker crane, 50 feet above the pit, or whatever it is. They're the sort of crazy things that we end up doing.
Absolutely.
I've asked every conductor this, and you will be no different. When you come to learn a new score, do you have especially because you're a pianist, do you have a set system? Do you use a piano to learn a new score, or do you do the other version, which is to sit in silence and learn the soundtrack that way? Do you start at the beginning and work your way through, or do you flick through and then go zoom in, zoom in? And are you a scribbler? Do you scribble on your scores? Do you use pens, pencils? Or are you one of these lucky people who like to keep the score completely virginal and not make a single mark? What do you do?
Unfortunately, I scribble all over the score, and
don't say unfortunately. I do as well. I think it helps me learn it personally.
I think it does. I'm still not sure if it actually does, or if I just feel I need to do something to give the impression that I'm learning it. I'm still not quite sure which one it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually just picked up. It was a couple of weeks ago now. I don't know why I was flicking through it, but I picked up my score of Beethoven 4, and this was the piece that I conducted when I was awarded first prize in the Salzburg Young Conductors Award. And I can barely read the notes. I mean, there are so many sticky notes that I've kind of torn out and cut out and put here, there, and everywhere. Yeah. And I thought, my God, how did I even read the music? I do make a conscientious effort to write less in the score, but to answer your question, it actually just depends on how much time I have to learn it. I mean, if we talk about an ideal world, I would say I like to kind of do the full shebang, which is start actually without the score to begin with, and just start and do a history of what that music's about. And often I'll write kind of notes, pages of A4 to myself on notebooks, and I'll just write to myself what was happening at that time in the composer's life, what came before, what came after, what were the influences, and just trying to get into the world of what was happening at the time, because of course that does influence interpretation later on. I try and work in a methodical way at the beginning. I think I have a pretty methodical method, which is an analysis to an extent. I don't do a musicologist's analysis of the work. But I will try and work out exactly what's happening where, the structures, harmonies, things like that. And that gives you a mental picture of what the playing field actually looks like. Then purely aesthetically, I mark in kind of phrase lengths, bar lengths, things like that. And then I essentially work from bigger to smaller. So when I start on, the big movements, I'll then try and focus on the smaller aspects, and then I'll try and work on that phrase. But it's hard because obviously most of what we do is a very mental process. And so you're not, you're not working with spreadsheets, or you're not working with, emails. You can't just put things in folders so easily. So sometimes, you do get carried away. And while I might have wanted to spend the past hour, working on an analysis of this particular part of the movement, I end up conducting it through physically, because I just, I felt like it. So I try and be methodical where I can. The process is always changing. And then, sometimes I've been in situations where I've had to jump in with orchestras with works that I have never heard before.
Yeah.
And this is where I am very, very fortunate that we live in the day and age of recording and digital sound, because that is a huge help if it needs to be. Certainly, yes. I don't learn a score in that way.
Many people have said the same. Even if it's a big symphony that they never conducted, that it's good to go back and listen to historical recordings, and also of your contemporaries. I spoke to somebody very recently who said, often they'd listen to a recording and thought, do you know what, that's a brilliant idea. Why hadn't I thought of that? Yeah. But not to steal, but just to inform yourself with what's out there.
Yeah.
And also video as well. So video as well. Yeah. That we've got YouTube now. We've got everything seems to be videoed and recorded. Plus things like the Berlin Philharmonic Concert Hall. There's so much information there to inform you, but not to copy.
No, exactly, and that is an important distinction to make, especially when it comes to video. And going back to the conversation on technique and things like that, I think imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Is that the right?
I think that's the right phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the right phrase. But ultimately, yeah, we have to be true to ourselves. Of course, we do inform ourselves what other colleagues and the conductors of yesteryear do. But ultimately, we have to do it because we believe in it, and we believe that is what the composer wanted.
Kerem, it is time for the 10 questions. And so, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
I think sound that I love, and this is coming from my Cypriot background and having spent many summers in Cyprus as a young child, would probably be two things. It's the sound of the barbecue, and also the sound of the waves lapping at the beach, certainly in the Mediterranean anyway. Sounds that I hate, I have to say it's probably influenced from a past experience where I finished the end of a very, very quiet, slow movement, and I was so happy with how it went. And there was a police siren that just started in the distance, got louder, and then went past. And I was fuming that happened. And so ever since, probably the sound of police sirens.
It's amazing, the sound of the outside world coming into a concert hall it can ruin a moment, can't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, I can remember very, very, very many occasions either conducting or playing, and you just think, oh, what a shame. My favourite story, and I must tell this because it's just popped into my head. Somewhere I joined the CBSO, some of the older members of the orchestra told me this story. It's from the days when the CBSO used to play in the town hall in Birmingham, which is not Symphony Hall, it's a smaller building. And there used to be a road that went up to the side of the town hall and then did a right angles and then down the hill onto New Street. All the buses used to go down there, and the orchestra had just finished a very quiet ending of the symphony with Naomi Yervi conducting, and a motorbike did exactly what you just said. It got louder and louder and louder, and then turned the right angles and then went down the hill down New Street. Apparently, Naomi Yervi stopped the orchestra as he should have done, held his pose, and then basically conducted the motorbike as it went away down New Street in the concert. which to have the sheer balls to do that just made me laugh out loud. but yeah, it really can ruin a wonderful moment. You know, a church bell in the distance. You know, at the wrong moment, it just ruins it. Brilliant answer.
Absolutely. And that sounds like a very, very heavy thing to do from the stories that I've heard anyway.
Next one. If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
So I am currently in the process of getting a PPL, which is a private pilot's license. So I would go and fly some circuits in a plane.
Yeah. You're joining quite a few previous.
I know.
Daniel Harding, obviously, because you know he's a pilot with Air France as well as being a world famous conductor. But quite a lot of people have either wished to do it or actually are doing it. Who would be a favourite conductor of yesteryear?
I mean, if that I have the option of choosing more than one. I mean, I can't imagine the number of conductors that have said Carlos Kleiber, but of course, there is the wonderful Carlos Kleiber. Giulini, Carlo Giulini, was also a phenomenal conductor. There are some absolutely transcendental recordings of Bruckner symphonies with Celi Bidake. I mean, those are the ones that have come to mind right now. But of course, there's many, many more as well, I'm sure.
Kleiber makes regular appearances as the answer to this question, but I've not put a moratorium on him yet. Because, frankly, he's my answer anyway, so I can't put a moratorium on it. And favourite current conductors?
So as I said towards the beginning of this kind of little podcast, one of my formative experiences was watching Antonio Pappano rehearse, and I have to say Tony Pappano, because he really is an absolutely phenomenal musician. He is a singer's conductor. He is also very much an orchestra's conductor as well. He really embodies the music, and he absolutely loves what he does, and I find that extraordinarily inspiring.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
So, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier in the podcast, physically, I would say conducting Tales of Hoffmann, that opera is, I mean, I love it, but without cuts, or without the right cuts, I should say, it's probably about half an hour too long sometimes. And it is so tiring that you start at 7 and that you really finish closer to 11 p.m. at night. It really takes a great technique and a lot of yoga and and physiotherapy and massages afterwards to kind of get through it. So physically, I would say that. I think emotionally and technically, I had the crazy chance of stepping in for Bernard Haitink and the Concertgebouw Orchestra a couple of years ago to conduct Mahler 9. And I have never come across, I mean, the work is still an enigma to me. I don't know if I'll ever really understand it or confess to being able to understand it, but that work is it's really in another dimension, on another level. It's extraordinary.
Talking physically as you were about opera, I would say that the hardest thing I've ever done physically was opera, and I did all 3 of the Trittigo Puccini operas at the Birmingham Conservatoire, but I did them twice in a day on a Saturday because we had a matinee and then an evening, and me being me, I didn't put in a dep for my rehearsal with the Birmingham School Symphony Orchestra in the morning either. So I did an hour and a half in the morning, and then did a full Trittigo in the afternoon, and then another one in the evening. There was a point in the middle of Suor Angelica in the evening where I thought, is this ever going to stop? And are my arms ever going to be able to do anything again? And then it got to, Senza Mama, and I just forgot all the pain and thought, oh my God, and then you're thrown into the music again. But yeah, God, it can really take it out of you, can't it, opera?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons that it can be so tiring is because no matter what you planned in opera, you have to be ready for something different, because things just go wrong, whether that's through somebody's direct or indirect fault. Things do go wrong, and you have to be ready to just wait those couple of seconds, which by the way, feel like, an eternity longer, or, come in a little bit earlier than you expected. And the other thing, which is purely kind of logistical, is that being in a pit and knowing that your beat, your arms, what you conduct with, has to be seen by singers sometimes at the very back of a very big stage. I mean, and then physically having to conduct higher than you normally would if the podium doesn't raise in the pit.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm quite small. I'm not particularly tall, so that's often a problem for me. That is just hard work as well. Yeah.
When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Do I thought this would be a difficult one to answer, but then I was speaking to my girlfriend about this, and I figured actually it's pretty simple. Slippers. I take my really comfy pair of slippers everywhere. And for some reason, it just makes me feel more at home in whichever hotel room or, Airbnb that you might be staying in for that week. Really highly recommended to any conductors out there, if they don't do it already, that is.
No, because I think nobody's answered slippers before in 50 odd episodes. So you win with slippers. Brilliant. What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
I would love to change the amount that we travel, or that we have to travel. I know there's a certain amount of irony saying that in the middle of the pandemic, where airlines aren't flying and we're not, for the most part, not really traveling very far. Yeah. But when things are in full swing, as they normally are, that is, for me, the most difficult aspect of being a conductor, is simply taking the plane, the train, the taxi, the bus, and dragging your suitcase around sometimes, which is packed with 2.5 weeks of clothes, 3 weeks of clothes, and just knowing that you have 3 different concert outfits in there because you simply need that. It's really physically tiring, and I would love to change that if I could.
Well, I think you're right in that, at least for the meantime, with various countries' quarantine rules more than anything else, travelling is proving to be difficult. Conductors all of a sudden are finding that they have to stop for 2 weeks in a hotel before they can work somewhere, or when they get home, they have to stop at home for 2 weeks. So one wonders when we'll get back to that tiring existence. And in the meantime, maybe we should enjoy the fact that we're not, if we can manage to work. But yeah, you're right. It's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
Especially if you're doing more than a week at a time. If you're on, you're doing a 2 or 3 week trip, and you're changing countries and you're flying in between, and you've got to take 3 weeks of scores with you, and it's tough.
Yeah.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, I mentioned it earlier on, and I know that it's a popular one amongst conductors. I don't know why it is, but I have to say I genuinely wanted to do this long before I actually thought about conducting, going to air shows as a 6 or 7 year old. But I would be a pilot if I had the chance. And well, I hopefully will be. I have quite a few more hours to go, and a few more exams to take. But I'm kind of getting there. So I'd have to say being a pilot.
It's the 2 recurring things in the 10 questions. We could probably form a small squadron of conductors. and I have to say, if I booked a box at Lord's for a day's Test cricket, I could also fill it with conductors who would love to be there and enjoy a day's cricket at Lord's with me. There seems to be a lot of cricket-loving conductors and a lot of pilots. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, wonder why. I don't know.
There must be some similarities, but
don't know what.
I don't know. Nothing about control, that's for sure. But who knows? Who knows?
If the world was to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
I have to say, kind of on the grandma line, my grandma's cooking. You simply cannot beat it. And I think if the world really was ending, then having a plate of traditional Cypriot food, I think that is just that for me is world class. I would also say I was very fortunate to have a great week in Florence last year. And my girlfriend and we dined at the most amazing restaurant, Florentine steak I think it was just, I mean, and it was so memorable. I was there in the restaurant for about 3 hours, just taking it all in, just taking in the atmosphere. So at the moment, and it probably will change in a couple of years, those are my two things.
And what would you wash it down with?
To begin with, you'd need a really, really good glass of well, certainly from the Italian restaurant that we ate at, House Red. Yeah. Wonderful. And then I would have just a shot of very, very strong Cypriot Zivania.
Brilliant. Absolutely wonderful. Thoroughly enjoyed the last hour, Kerem, and I hope you did, and I hope that we meet each other very soon.
I hope so too. Thank you very much.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat to a conductor who started out his musical career as a professional trumpet player, but after winning the Donatella Flick conducting competition in 2004, he's gone on to be a music director in both Canada and his native France. But until then, bye-bye.